Welcome to the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby. AlphaList is a closed community with over 400 CTOs who share their knowledge and experience in a Slack space and at events. With this podcast, we want to give our members and interested parties insights into the thoughts and ideas of top CTOs. If you're interested in becoming a member of the community, please visit alphalist.com to find out more on how to apply. Sastrify is the Agile SaaS procurement solution for progressive tech companies. Value proposition is reducing your SaaS spend and save time to let you focus on the essentials. Sastrify's SaaS experts negotiate with SaaS vendors such as Google, Miro, Asana, Salesforce or others the best conditions for existing contracts as well as for upcoming renewals. My company OMR is a customer of Sastrify and saves us many hours of work and reduces the SaaS spend significantly, for instance. Other large customers to mention are Gorillas, Rantastic, Westwing or Emma. Sastrify's promise is they save you more money than they cost. Special offer, which is only valid until the end of the year, is a 50% discount for the first 3 months, and you can claim it on sastrify.com/alphalist.
Welcome to the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby, and today with me is Chad Fowler. And Chad Fowler is a musician, used to be the CTO of Six Wunderkinder, the company behind Wunderlist, used to work at Microsoft, and is now general manager at Blue Yard Capital. And from my perspective, he's really like a crazy bird. He is one of my early Ruby heroes. So he has written several books about Ruby. He wrote a book that is called My Job Went to India. He's hopefully telling us about today as well. And in a way, he's like a jack of all trades. So he knows everything, and he seems to be good in everything. And we want to talk about that and about leadership today. Chad, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start with your early nerd path. So how did you get into the whole thing?
So I was a saxophonist and a composer of modern classical music. Not that it's actually called classical. And I was playing music for a living. And I got a computer. It was in like 1992, and it had Doom on it. Doom 2, I think, the id Software game. Maybe it was Doom, but one of them. And I started playing it, and then I learned you could play multiplayer, which was a new thing. And I got on a local BBS system and found someone to play with. And once I played Doom Deathmatch for the first time, I was hooked, and I realized that I needed to understand how computers work, and that was what I was going to do with myself. Go ahead.
I could connect you to John Romero. He was actually on the podcast once. Maybe he wants to play a round of deathmatch still.
Yeah, I could show him my Doom tattoo that I have. Crazy. I wanted to learn how it worked because I thought that, like, especially one-on-one deathmatch was just such a beautiful thing. It was an amazing scenario where they could create this digital environment inside of which you had so much freedom and flexibility and ability to be creative. And I was just so fascinated by that I started learning programming. So I would go play my blues band gigs at night and bring these big, thick computer books with me, because that was what you had to buy back then, these big, thick, heavy things, carry them out there, and then on the breaks between the sets, I would sit and read these books and try to learn how computer programming worked. So that's how I got started.
And how does that compare to jazz music or classical music? I mean, learning programming compared to learning music theory and so on?
Yeah, I've always felt that it was very similar, and that it used the same parts of the brain, and it tapped into the same reserves of passion and excitement that I had for composition. or jazz improvisation, because that's basically just real-time composition. So the concept behind jazz composition or any kind of composition is typically you have some flashes of creativity where you come up with some ideas. Now, once you have the ideas, you have a bunch of problems that you need to solve. And the problems are, how do you put these ideas together in a way that's compelling and that flow from one to the next and fit together properly? So you can sort of get the idea that there are like components that have to fit together, and there are rules for how they fit together. And depending on the sorts of rules you apply or abstractions you apply, you will have different sounds and different effects. So, and even sort of lock yourself into different metaphorical rooms, if you're not careful, where the composition goes a certain way and it can't go another way without being really strange. So yeah, to me, it's almost exactly the same thought process, and I see them both as creativity and both as craft and art.
So those moments of let's say deep flow, right, as DHH calls, is typically then when you are really like in the tunnel. And I can imagine how it is a bit, because I learned piano in my early 20s, I think, and it was also around like improvisation, and I really found myself in like exactly the same situation as when I try or when I spend the night with my computer and solve problems, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that you learned in your early 20s. That's an unusual time to pick up a musical instrument. So you're probably young enough to be able to learn quickly and old enough to be able to understand and appreciate the process of learning and remember it.
Yeah, but in a way, it felt like a bit late. So I think like ideally you learn piano in your very early days, and like you really get to that level of flow very quickly, where you really improvise something. But I had a very good teacher who was really into improvisation, and he was teaching me, let's say, easy blues scales and so on, and that kind of felt very natural to just jam for hours. And that is what I really liked about it, like the whole theoretical aspects, or let's say more complex music theory. I really hated it. But yeah, that just playing and just hearing that it in a way sounds nice if you use the right scale and you use the right combinations, is kind of a good thing. So I think like for computers it was better for me, because I started very early, and that in a way.
So in computers, do you like to just play and improvise, or do you like to know the theory?
I like to know the theory.
Is that how you are? Oh, you do.
I like to know the theory. I think it's the difference is that I started with computers when I was 12 years old, and first I played. Like I also got into it through gaming, and then kind of was using a Windows computer, and then ended up with programming batch script, like the early .bat files, and then like modified games a bit and so on, and somehow went into programming, and then went into the web at the early times, and then ended up like really professionally using Ruby and a lot of other languages. They kind of developed naturally, and I think that was missing for me with music. So when did you start?
What's interesting is, sorry, you're trying to ask me a question, but I'm going to talk about something that I thought of as you were speaking. When I read The Pragmatic Programmer by Dave Thomas and Andy Hunt, one of the things they talk about in there, it was the first time I heard this phrase, was programming by coincidence, which means I just do stuff until it works, and then it's sort of like a coincidence that it works, which is sort of how we all start. I think, or a lot of us start when we get into new technologies, especially like, let me try something and see what happens, and eventually you realize I'm making things work, but I don't know how it works. under the
Mm-hmm.
covers, and therefore I'm lacking some power. And they talk about programming by coincidence as if it's a bad thing that should be avoided, which sounds like it should when I describe it this way, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the failures that we have in music education is we don't let people start by programming by coincidence, playing and just seeing what happens. And it sounds like that's what you were doing in your early 20s on the piano, in a sense, was like, I like to just play things and see how it sounds and then learn by playing, as opposed to stepping back and starting with all of the fundamentals. So I wonder if there is something to be said in software development for learning by playing. And I don't mean playing Doom like I did. That was important for me because it caught me on fire and got me excited. But like, goof around with things and see what happens, and then get yourself into a situation where you need to know the theory, and therefore you're motivated to learn the theory, versus the other way around where you're sitting in a college or university not understanding why you're learning about different data structures or whatever because you've never needed to use them.
But isn't it what is fascinating about computers, that you can in a way learn by just playing? I mean, not playing Doom, but just approaching it in a very playful way, and then somehow being sucked into it, and like at a certain moment you just understand. You have that aha moment where you say, okay, it's so easy. This is how the theory works, and this is what is behind it. That is really, for me, it was always that way. Also,
yeah, me too. And it's because we started on our own and we were playing with the computers, and then we started learning the theory, probably. But if you go to university, as a first year student, they're not going to start you off trying to make you have fun goofing around and making mistakes. And it kind of seems like that would be a better way for everyone to start, sort of like apply what would happen organically if you had stumbled into software development as a child, try to get you started that way as, an older child or young adult. Maybe we would have better software developers then.
Maybe, like, potentially even more creative developers. I mean, in university in Germany, you start with Java, and or typically that was the case a few years ago, at least. And it doesn't end up nicely for a lot of people. I think, like, you should have like the creative approach as well, and learn the creative approach as well. And but tell me a bit more. So you started then, after you studied music, and then somehow stumbled into your first computer job, or what happened?
Oh yeah, a friend of mine named Walter. He was also a saxophonist that played in the bands I was in. Like, we were playing in soul bands in Memphis, Tennessee. He's the sort of person that just likes to have someone to ride in the car with or go to lunch with, and so he thought it would be more fun at his job if I worked there. So he applied for a job for me. And because he had recommended me, his boss just hired me without even interviewing me at the time. She said, Walter says you're good, so when can you start? And it was just a computer support job. We were young. I guess I was 21 or so at the time when I got that job. And it paid, American minimum wage, which was pathetically low at the time. And from there, I just obsessed. So, I was in that job, and like you were talking about, writing batch files and stuff like that. I did that. I got really into Perl, the programming language, and wrote some systems. Oh, yeah?
yeah. Flat file databases and so on.
Yeah.
CGI bin.
Yes. Yeah, and I was writing systems for like authentication and authorization of the systems at the place where we worked, which I think were in production for, I don't know, like 10 or 15 years, which is sort of scary because it was literally my first programs. Like, I didn't even know how to format the files. No one told me you should indent, and it was terrible.
I had exactly the same path I went through. And then you suddenly were CTO of Six Wunderkinder, or
yeah, that's how it worked. Yeah. Okay, so I met someone at my workplace who, I was doing support. I was having to walk around and help people, when they couldn't print and that sort of stuff. And I met this guy named Ken who sat in some back room, and you would call him if things were really bad because he had designed all the systems and networks and stuff. And the first day I met him, there was some sort of like disastrous outage at work. So he came and helped. It was on a Sunday when I was working. And I said, how did you learn to do all this stuff? And he said, come to my office on Monday in the afternoon, and I will start teaching you things. So he did. And he gave me a sort of like career progression that the nerd in me turned into something like a skill tree from a role-playing game. And it was, you should learn 3 things. You should learn a programming language, some Unix operating system, and some sort of directory service. And that was sort of a function of the time. It was the 90s, and people were adopting Novell's NDS, eventually Active Directory, LDAP, those sorts of structures. It was a big deal then. So I started learning those things very seriously, and I thought of them. I mean, it's sort of like a coincidence that there are 3 paths there that are very different. And I thought of them like literally like a skill tree in a video game, where you've got your 3 categories of skills and you're trying to work your way up. It gives you flexibility within those 3. So I chose Linux, Perl, and NDS, which was the Novell directory service, which led me to become really expert in how hierarchical authentication authorization services worked, just because I was so interested in it, which led me to digging really deep into LDAP when that became a thing, the lightweight directory access protocol. And I started messing with like Netscape's implementation and Open LDAP, whatever the original open source one was. And all of these skills led to a real job, because that was the minimum wage young person job. And I ended up getting a job at FedEx, which is one of the biggest employers in Memphis. They're based there. And at that point, I think I initially started out making more money than either of my parents. And I was, 22 years old, and never actually graduated from university. And that just started this, the role-playing game sort of aspect to my career became something that I was very focused on, both from the perspective of constantly building skills. Like, it was this really exciting environment to feel myself growing and getting better and smarter, and all of the things I would learn would directly relate to like new things that I could do at work or even at home with my nerdy Linux setup and all the stuff that I was doing. That it really became a passion at that point, and I could never put it down.
Yeah, I think like reading your CV for the first time feels, or it seems to me, that you do not like to spend time in your comfort zone. Is that true? So you have that constant learning, and is it? I guess it's also like a playful approach to constantly learning, constantly getting better, and like from being a programmer, becoming a manager potentially, and then a CTO and so on.
Yeah.
Is that true, or is there like an alarm that is ringing whenever you are in your comfort zone, or what happens?
Yes. Yeah. So anecdotally, I went from FedEx to General Electric, and at General Electric, I was quite successful. Still very early in my career, still in my 20s. I got to the point where I was CTO of a GE business, and I found myself getting comfortable. And that's why I mentioned this. I sort of tricked myself into saying like, well, I can work here forever because I can just go from business to business. It's such a large company, and I lived in India for a while when I worked there. And a friend of mine from the Ruby community, a very early Ruby community, like 12 people in Ruby IRC at the time. One of them was Mats, the creator of Ruby. I was talking to him about it. David Allen Black is his name. He's a fairly well-known author and software developer there. And I was trying to decide, should I leave? Because I had this opportunity to go work at this, sort of large, well-funded startup in town where I lived at the time in Kentucky. And he asked me the question, is it your destiny to work at General Electric? And when he asked that, I said, "Oh God, no, never, definitely not." And that sort of changed my thinking about career path from then on. Because at the time, I was really on track to try to become CIO of a GE business and eventually like a full-fledged vice president at one of the largest corporations in the world. And oh, what a dreadfully sad thing that would have been for me. It's not how I thrive.
Yeah, wearing a tie and so on, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And but how did you become a manager then?
Oh, well, that was at GE, and it was a comfort zone thing, I guess. I the the team that I joined there was part of IT, but it was like the people doing all the new stuff. We were at GE Appliances, so one of the divisions of GE. But I think we were the first team to do e-commerce at GE, and we also like set up new application infrastructure. So it was the early days of Java enterprise development. It was before the servlet spec was something people used, before EJBs and all that. So we set up all the first app servers, and basically I was there from the very beginning, and I built up, along with a couple of other people, the whole infrastructure and environment for hundreds of developers to build on to create modern applications that were not on the mainframe and not client server. And I've always been a good communicator, which I guess led to people just naturally coming to me to find out what was going on and to hear ideas about, I don't know, the future of the internet, and how GE should be approaching it. And that's when they asked me to be a manager. And I remember it because that at the time, for a long time, was my favorite team I'd ever been on. And they asked me to be manager of that team. And when I became manager, suddenly I didn't have any friends because the people that were on that team were my friends, and now I'm their boss. And it's not like they, intentionally shunned me, but I got the first taste of the loneliness of management and leadership from that experience. I remember the first day they all went out to lunch and didn't ask me. They walked by and they went out to lunch, and I was like, oh, and it might have been like the first week that I became a manager. And so that started my love-hate relationship with management too, which leans honestly very heavily to hate, for myself. I don't like being a manager at all, but I've done it many times over my career, and usually because I end up building something, and then again the curse of being outgoing and able to communicate well leads to people asking me. And then the combination of my desire to help my company succeed wherever it may be, and my ego of being proud to be asked and getting excited and doing it, I just keep falling into it over and over again. Then eventually bail out and go do something else.
I can imagine. And always having that superpower of being able to code is a very nice thing as a manager as well, right?
Yeah, and if you become a manager where you're like a serious manager and you have to do it full time, there's a clock that's ticking. Like the first time I remember it happening, I was at Living Social. I was SVP of technology for 2 years, and that was a big management job. And that was maybe the time when I really figured out you can't be a programmer and be a manager if you've got a large enough team, because the job is too much. And if you try to be a programmer, you're being selfish. So 2 years went by where I didn't program anything for work, except for a couple of failed attempts where I just, I was too distracted by my day job, and I ended up making mistakes. One really embarrassing one on Thanksgiving one year, maybe I can tell you about, but that's when I ended up bailing out of that one, to go be CTO for Sechs Wunderkinder, because I had to get back hands on with technology, and I could feel it slipping away from me. And I do feel like as I age, it's harder and harder to imagine being able to re-immerse myself and relearn all the new stuff, So like I went from a time when almost no one was doing cloud computing to everyone was doing cloud computing. That was the time that I wasn't doing hands-on tech. And there was so much to learn. It was terrifying. But yeah, you're right that, it's a superpower to know how technology works in a really visceral, hands-on way when you're dealing with technologists as a manager.
And you learned Ruby at Six Wunderkinder or where?
Oh, no, no. So Six Wonderkinder I joined in 2013. I learned Ruby starting in 2000.
Wow.
Um,
Okay. Yeah, that's very, very early. Yeah.
yeah, I remember being excited when the book Programming Ruby came out because I was already using Ruby and I wanted a book about how to program in it. So, that was very, very early.
And that was the same time when your job went to India, literally.
Yes, yeah, right around then. So I was playing around with Ruby a lot, and when I lived in India, and actually the Ruby IRC channel was a big connection for me back to uh, the States and the sort of culture that I recognized.
Okay. So you moved from DC to India to Berlin. How do the cultures
No,
compare? Like,
yeah, yeah. In fact, I grew up in Arkansas, and that's where I am now. And in the States, Arkansas is in the south central. It's a place with a beautiful environment and very, very ugly politics. And one of those that's always very low on the list of best educated states in the country. So basically, Arkansas sucks, and it's got its own culture. It's ignorant and embarrassing. And then I went to Memphis where I did the music stuff, and that was, sort of like Southern soul culture that I was mostly immersed in. Then I went to Kentucky. Then I went to India. Then back. Then Colorado. Then DC. Then Berlin. And yes, it was, the cultures are almost not comparable. Although I would say that one thing I've noticed as I've traveled is culture changes as you move toward the equator. So, South India has a lot of the same sort of properties as the southern United States relative to North India, that sort of thing. It's kind of hard to compare them, although I will say that the Indian culture and the shock of being there as an American who was fairly insulated as a child um, was the most impactful thing that happened to me in my life in terms of understanding the world and developing my career and pretty much anything else uh, because it was so different. It was the first time that I was clearly a person in the ethnic minority. Like everywhere I go, people look at me and point and follow me around, that sort of thing. I learned to speak a couple of Indian languages, and I studied an Indian musical instrument called the Veena while I was there, with a person who didn't speak English, in a place where they weren't used to seeing foreigners come in, and so I really took the opportunity to immerse myself in India and learning everything I could about Indian culture and putting myself again in very uncomfortable situations as often as possible. Like walking around in villages where they'd never seen foreigners, but I could speak to people because I had learned Hindi. So yeah, a very impactful thing that everyone should try to do if they get a chance. Not necessarily India, but move to a place where the culture is different, the language is different, you look different, and see what it takes or what it does to your mind and your brain.
and in India, was there like a very spiritual moment or something where you decided, okay, I have to like become more of a hands-on guy again and move to Berlin and apply for a job at Six Wunderkinder, or what was that like when the key moment to move away?
Well, so the timing there was I was in India and I was setting up a software center. This was for GE at the time, and totally hands-off tech again. So when I moved back, I was still at GE, and I did go for an absolutely hands-on job, like totally different thing. And it was a situation where we had this crazy legacy system that was built in C, running on HPUX, and talking to the Mobitex radio frequency network. And the person who created the system and had maintained it for decades left sort of suddenly. So I was on the track to be like a large team manager when I got back on the executive path. But at the division where I was one of the only people they could imagine could figure out the system after this guy left. So instead of joining boardrooms and, being a fancy manager at a large corporation, I spent many nights, me and one other guy, his name was Anirban, all night in the office, like running strace on processes on a Linux machine, trying to reverse engineer protocols because we couldn't understand the code the guy wrote and that sort of thing. So just this weird ping-ponging back from set up software development business from the ground and hire everyone and put processes into place to going back to the States and sitting in a cubicle all night, hacking and troubleshooting. And I apologize. I mean, I guess you started this the wrong way with me. You said crazy bird, so I'm just in crazy bird mode. But the timeline of my career is so screwy too. There are so many twists and turns. It's sort of hard to follow the path without making it really boring, I guess.
So. And you seem to be somehow attracted by, let's say, languages that become very popular before they are popular, right? I mean, Ruby, that was like very, very early for Ruby, and it was kind of very unpopular and very strange to do it until DHH came up with that crazy framework. And I also saw that you're into Elixir as well, which is like, I remember like a moment when I was chatting to a guy in Berlin like a few years ago, and he said, we have to find a CTO who's able to maintain our Elixir application, because the only guy that was able to do it just left. And it was in a way the same with Ruby and with Elixir now. So what is the next crazy technical thing that you're going to discover and going to follow?
I don't know. And I don't think I'm into technologies that happen to that take off. It's not like I can predict it. It's more that I'm into fringy technologies, and sometimes they do take off. So, like Ruby, people literally laughed when I talked about it at work, because they just thought I was crazy for wasting my time with it. And it did pay off for me ultimately. I mean, Ruby is a great language and I loved it, and it didn't matter if it was going to pay off. But you can sort of think of technology investment, and when it comes to your own personal investments that you make, as the same way that you would financial investment. So right now, if you want a conservative investment, then learn Python or something like that, or even Java, because you can do Android apps and back-end apps. There will be a return on that investment. You'll be able to use the language and make stuff and get a job, but the return is going to be small, because that's it. There's too much competition. It's too large. It's like late stage. If you were to invest in something like, I don't know, Rust, that's not even new, but it still hasn't taken off. If you were to invest in that, you could become someone who is noteworthy in the Rust community. You might even be able to fill in a gap that hasn't been filled already. And then if Rust gets big, you are an expert, and maybe you have a name in that community, and you leverage that to get new opportunities. So that's sort of what happened with Ruby, although I would be rewriting history if I said I was really intelligent and I decided to make a bet in this little fringe language and I knew it was going to be huge. That's not the case. I never expected anyone to be into it. And I actually was sort of following around these fringe languages, and like my other hobby at the time in the early 2000s was learning about obfuscated programming languages. So just, the ones that are the craziest. Like
white space and
white space, yeah, malbolge, and I love that sort of stuff. Obviously, that's never going to take off, but I did it for my own benefit and creativity and fun.
It also doesn't fit to the tweet that you stick to your Twitter profile. The older I get, the more I realize the biggest problem to solve in tech is to get people to stop making things harder than they have to be. That doesn't really fit well together with Rust and whitespace and so on, right?
Well, I think it does, because, the tweet is talking about building solutions. And I have an old post that I wrote in the year 2001, actually, which was called Valueless Software. And you probably can't find it because I've destroyed my blog now. But the idea was that as a musician, when you practice, if it sounds good, you're probably not actually practicing, you're playing. And musicians don't show up at a gig and perform something they don't know. They sit at home and they go through the pain of doing something and learning, And most of the stuff that you do at home is not something you would ever give to someone to listen to. So you play scales and intervals and long tones where you just hold them for a long time. The output of the music you're making at home has no value. It's the practice that's the value, right? And so I think stuff like messing with malbulge and white space and all those, that's practice, where you're not going to do it to try to build something of value. Because if you try to build something of value, you get distracted from the learning process and from the self-development process. That said, I don't put Rust in that category. Rust is difficult because you don't know it already. Same with Haskell. And because it is sufficiently different from what most of us do that we have to think harder to learn it. And it's too much trouble for most people, right? So I think Rust fits very well into the spirit of that tweet of not trying to make things harder than they need to be, because Rust solves some problems in a specific context that actually makes it easier to solve the problems. If you try building systems in C where you've got all these memory issues, why do that now when you don't have to? Using C would be making things harder than they need to be. Using Rust, if you can get over the laziness of not wanting to learn new concepts, makes it easier.
Makes sense.
I guess that every of my listener CTOs out there knows this challenge. Traditional content management systems, where front-end and back-end are tightly coupled, make it difficult to reuse content in different digital channels. The next generation of headless CMS is much more flexible for developers, but comes with strong constraints for editors. The goal of Storyblock is building the world's first headless CMS that works for both developers and business users. Storyblock offers a combination of visual editing tools and highly customizable content blocks. This is built on modern headless architecture that gives developers the flexibility to build fast and reliable digital platforms. The big benefit of headless CMSs is that content can be streamed to any platform via API without having to manage the content multiple times. For example, customers use Storyblock for their websites, online stores, apps, or send the same content to Twitter, WeChat, or to Alexa skills. Storyblock is now used by over 50,000 developers, product owners, and managers in over 80,000 projects in 130 countries. Customers include Adidas, Marley Spoon, Deliveroo, and many, many more. If you want to know more, please visit storyblock.com/OMR. That's storyblock.com/OMR.
And then stepping back to Six Wunderkinder, you were applying mostly Ruby, and really became like a startup CTO. And I guess it was a crazy growth story as well, right? Where you were applying Ruby there, you were using Ruby there, right?
Yeah. In fact, it was more like we were recovering from Ruby there. So I was sought out by them and hired because I was known as a Ruby expert, which is a whole sort of funny thing, because why no one had proof that I was a Ruby expert, but I'd just been doing it and loud about it, So I went there, and I think within the first week, I started talking about rewriting some systems in other languages like Scala and that sort of thing. And by the time we were done with Wunderlist, when we sold it, the back end had, 12 different languages or something crazy like that.
Oh,
we
great.
moved to this really intense microservices architecture. And for me, it was that system that I was most passionate about, and less about which languages you used. In fact, it was by design, you could pretty much use any language you wanted as long as it fit within certain rules that we set up. For example, worked with our build system, that kind of thing. But the growth story, yes, when I joined, they had just launched Wunderlist 2, which was the first big rewrite they did. And on the day that they launched it, I think it was up for less than 10 seconds before it crashed. And then it was down for 2 weeks or something because it could not handle the scale. They had built it. They had built this monolithic Ruby on Rails API system. They had built a synchronization system that didn't work and was never going to work. There was no way. But we had millions of users on it, and we were stuck. So that's what I immediately did, was start the bailout process with the team and start building up processes and skills around dealing with fragile systems, and start pulling apart the monolith, which we did for a couple of years.
And would you do it again in the same style? I mean, you in a way had like a zoo of languages and like really microservice infrastructure. Like, how do you feel about this today?
I still love it. However, I love it and believe that if you just start with Erlang, then maybe you don't need to do any of that. So I love it for a couple of different reasons. One is the distributed nature of the system allows you to deal with scalability in a more granular way. So, we've all of us who've been CTOs especially have the experience where you have a monolithic system where one thing is slow and it slows everything down and the whole thing crashes and nothing works because the one thing was slow. In the way that we built our microservice architecture, if one thing went down, only the one thing was down. So, like maybe the comments service, we screwed that up. So you can do everything else. You just can't make comments on tasks. So, that's not good, but much better than full failure because it means some things can still be done. That I still loved. The other reason that I love it, though, is I like the ability to express things in different languages. And I like the freedom to do that. And I like my entire team to feel that freedom. Because I came from the cubicle world of people sitting around complaining about conservative choices by management and wishing you could use this or that technology, and then like applying for jobs at other places because you want to go use a technology you're passionate about. We didn't have that problem. One of the most junior people on the team actually suggested that we start doing stuff in Elixir in the year 2014, I guess, early 2014. And I said, sure, you know what the rules are. You can do it. You need one other person to do it with you. You need to, make it work with the build system, testing system, monitoring, the various things that we were using to make the system work. And he said, cool. And then a year and a half went by and he still didn't do it because he knew that was a big responsibility and he didn't have time to do it. He was never frustrated with me and never frustrated with the environment. He had the flexibility and he understood the reason for the rules, and he could introduce it responsibly when he finally wanted to, and he did, and enjoyed it, and everyone was happy with the choice. So the ability to work with different languages, I love what it does to my brain. Personally, I loved going from like Clojure to Scala to Haskell to Ruby to Go, et cetera, in one day as part of my job. I felt like it built new muscles, metaphorically speaking, of dealing with abstraction in a different way. Like I'd been doing a bunch of Haskell. We had a couple of Haskell services. And then someone introduced Clojure, and I didn't know Clojure, and I didn't really want to learn it that much just because I was busy doing other stuff. The first day I sat down and tried to do Clojure seriously, I remember the moment thinking, well, what would I do in Haskell? And sort of just having this intuition for good Clojure design. And my intuition ended up being correct. Even the terms that I was looking for were correct, and I could navigate the APIs and then put together a really nice, elegant, functional thing in Clojure, which was a language I barely knew at the time, functional JVM-based Lisp. And I don't know, I just experienced great joy from that. So you can't replicate that with Erlang and Elixir. But the first part you can. You can make really great distributed systems that are fault tolerant and have all these amazing properties of like supervision trees and stuff. And all the infrastructure we had to build around microservices was a waste if you look at what Erlang already provides, and especially the Elixir ecosystem, because that's like nice syntax and tooling on top of the existing Erlang ecosystem. But you would still miss the fun of, let's do Rust, let's do Haskell, let's do, I don't know, Pure Script or Clojure Script or whatever. It was wonderful to be able to experiment like that. And there were times where one of the rules that we had was, if you introduce a new service, it has to be this big, and I would hold up my fingers, the whole thing should basically fit on the screen when you use a new language. Because if it fails in the middle of the night and the person on call doesn't know that language yet, they can just rewrite it in a language they know and deploy it. And we actually did that in some cases where we had problems, and we just say, okay, rather than troubleshoot this thing, we'll just rewrite it in something we know and go ahead and deploy it right now, and then revisit it later.
Okay, but what I'm still missing in your career progression is there was a moment when you again stepped away from programming, right? You integrated Six Wunderkinder into Microsoft, and you were acquired by Microsoft, and then you went again like into your into your love-hate relationship with management.
Into my unhappy place. Yeah, it's true. Because one of the things I can do, so I mentioned being able to communicate well, and I said that from the perspective of being a programmer who can talk to management or I don't know, business people, whatever that means. But the other thing that I'm unfortunately pretty good at is making compromises and dealing with bureaucracy, I guess. So in the context of a startup getting acquired, it sort of didn't make sense for Christian Raber, who was the founder of Wunderlist, to lead the team in the context of Microsoft, because there was a huge culture mismatch there between, and I say that in the best possible way about Christian. He needs to be innovating. He needs to be in charge and making things his way with no compromise. When you get acquired and you go to a company like Microsoft, you don't do that. It doesn't work. It never will. Doesn't matter what the company is, what the intent is on both sides. It's not going to work. And so I ended up taking over leading the Wunderlist team after we were acquired. And I did that for, I don't know, a year and a half or so until I had to move to the US for family reasons. And I ended up in all sorts of totally non-technical jobs at Microsoft, like leading the team that deals with startups and the startup ecosystem, their accelerators around the world and all that, which was absolutely a business job, not even anything technology related in it, honestly. And another thing was leading a large part of the developer relations team from Microsoft, the cloud advocates. So a lot of the people that you hear about, in open source communities that work at Microsoft were on my team at the time.
Okay, interesting. But like from the outside perspective, it could look like the acquisition of Wunderlist for Microsoft wasn't the most successful acquisition because they, in a way, discontinued the product and so on. Mm-hmm. Is that the case, and why is that?
No. So, I mean, you could say, sure, you can have an opinion that it was not a successful acquisition, but one thing that most people miss is that though the Wunderlist brand went away, there was a thing called Microsoft To Do, which is available on all platforms and synchronizes with Exchange as the backend instead of the custom backend that we had built at Wunderlist. But the code inside of Microsoft To Do is actually Wunderlist. So, if the thing that we had launched when we were acquired was Wunderlist 3, Microsoft To Do is Wunderlist 4 with a new name.
Okay.
And it still exists and people use it. And, the beauty of running with Exchange as a background, a backend is we got all of the compliance features of Exchange, whether it be disaster recovery or privacy or, like really deep enterprise level stuff you need to run in banks, corporations, governments, education, et cetera. Just got it for free by running on Exchange. Some people don't like Microsoft To Do from a UX perspective, but that's just subjective now,
Understood. And in your different Microsoft positions, did you learn anything you would apply at a startup job these days? Like in terms of management skills, I don't know if you were using OKRs or anything. Anything you would recommend of adopting from the enterprise world, or?
Well, no. We did introduce OKRs, and when we did it, it was one of those top-down things, as it tends to be. I was very skeptical. So I said, I'm not going to do this unless I can learn a lot about it and really believe in it. So I read a book that I can't remember what it's called, but it's the one everyone said is the main one you want to read. And then I studied everything I could, listened to podcasts and videos, et cetera. And I thought deeply about how to apply OKRs and make it not be bullshit. And all of the things that I expected to happen with OKRs happen with OKRs. It is bullshit. The idea is not, but the implementation is and always will be in a large company. So what I learned is more of a confirmation that this is one of those things, sort of like Six Sigma, that is over-engineered, and the approach people will take will always pretty much be wrong because it's too rigid. And I learned that if I'm at a startup and someone brings it up, if it's a company under 30 people, I will tell them they're crazy. We can't do that. It's a waste of time. But I have confirmation bias for sure, because my bias coming into especially startups when it comes to organization is to resist all process until it is required to fix a problem. So, any named process at an early stage in a startup is just a disaster waiting to happen. Like, whether it's a named methodology or, I don't know, if they say you're going to have a scrum meeting, then that needs to be destroyed as early as possible if you joined a startup, because that's garbage too. It's just, whenever you name something, it gives someone an excuse to feel good that they've implemented something, because they implemented something with a name. And the name ends up being a proxy for progress. Sort of like when people really started getting into the watered down Agile thing, after Agile lost its meaning, people would talk about velocity and story points and how many points they completed and get really focused on that. But that's meaningless. Even the early Agile people would talk about story points and say, you could call it jelly beans. It doesn't represent anything. It's just this sort of like high level thing that gives you some sense of a velocity. And if you start focusing on that velocity, you can accomplish nothing, certainly nothing of value to the business, and feel great because the number is going up. I've seen that over and over again too. So totally not answering your question, crazy bird style, I guess, but I guess it just reaffirmed my beliefs that process is of the devil when you're at a startup, and you need to focus on solving problems and never focus on ceremony until it's absolutely necessary.
Well, I would. Yeah, I accept your opinion. I'm also not an OKR fan. What I think is good about the way that Agile went and how popular Agile processes became in Scrum and Kanban. The positive side is that you can like distill out a few elements of Scrum, like a daily stand-up. Absolutely makes sense from my perspective. It's like the most valuable thing that I've learned in the last 20 years.
Right. And because it solves a problem.
It solves a problem. And as long as you don't focus on the process itself, it's valuable. And the good thing about it is, like, if you talk these days about Kanban or Scrum, most people actually know what it's about. And I think that's like the difference between, let's say, in the modern startup world, just saying, yeah, we're doing like some sort of management by objectives, or we're doing OKRs. People know what you're talking about, right? The people have something on their mind, might be good, might be bad, but at least they know what you're talking about. And that can be like the positive thing.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. It's like
I mean,
design
really
patterns.
depending on, yeah, it's like design patterns, right?
Right. Why
You,
did they make design patterns? Because they wanted names for things that already existed so that there could be shorthand vocabulary for it. The problem with it is, and it's also true in design patterns, as soon as you learn the thing wrong, then that's what's stuck in your head and that's the thing you recognize. So
mm,
when I say OKR to most people who've ever participated in a company that use them, they have a bad, ineffective version of that methodology in their heads, and that's what they're going to go do. Um, the best ones will probably be disgusted when you say it, so you can also turn them off. But I think that's the case with Scrum. Like, say the word, if you're there, fine, because you can say, we're going to do something like Scrum, but we're going to do it this way. Whereas if you go to a company where they say, we're going to do Scrum, then probably they're just doing some really ineffective, slow, bureaucratic process that is anti-agile. And they're going to have a daily stand-up that lasts an hour and, and isn't a stand-up. And they're going to waste a bunch of time implementing process and feeling like they're doing the right thing. And no one's going to like it. No one's going to be excited about doing their Scrum junk or their OKRs or whatever. So, like, I totally agree that you get this this sort of like named structured thing that comes together in a block, and it has a name like OKR or Scrum or whatever. And it's a good way to get started. And the thoughts behind all of these are really good. Even Six Sigma, like I was a Six Sigma black belt at GE, which is embarrassing and kind of cool. But when you implement them, they get confused and screwed up. So what I would do is say, use them as inspiration, and then take the things that solve problems, like a daily stand-up. And the nice thing is you can read about what a stand-up is supposed to run like if you read one of the original Scrum papers or books, and then implement it that way instead of the way everyone else does when they say Scrum. But
yeah, just
that's
see
why
it
I
as
like
a
to throw away
toolbox,
the
right?
words.
See it
Yeah,
as a
exactly.
toolbox, and instead of seeing it as a thing you have to implement exactly how it was meant to be. Yeah, that's also how I think about OKR. So I hated it as well, or hated them as well after seeing it as a Lando. I hated it absolutely, but now it comes back, and I think, okay, if I see it as a toolbox, can it be good? And I think it can be good, but I don't
I
know
bet
yet.
it is if you're there doing it. That's the thing. If
Yeah.
you trust the people who are rolling it out, then it's probably okay. But if they take their eyes off of it at any point or they leave or something, then it will turn into the watered down garbage version of the process.
If you could give us 3 key learnings from your different perspective on engineering from startup to enterprise, what would you pass to our listeners? Which
Oh, man.
learnings? It's
I
hard,
don't
right?
know. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, had I spent some time thinking about it, it wouldn't be hard. I guess one of them is, I don't know what the other two will be, but one of them is do you want to interject something?
No, I just said, just want to say one is okay if if it's good.
Oh,
No
there could even
pressure.
be five. Yeah. No, there'll be more than one, I promise, because this one's not good enough. Uh, and the one I would say first is that small, um, keeping things small where possible is a way to increase chances of success. And the way I think when it comes to management or product design or architecture or software, hands-on programming is pretty much the same. I blend all these concepts together. And so small teams are proven to be more effective than large teams. That's an example. Small pieces of software are much easier to maintain than large pieces of software. Small databases are easier to scale and deal with than large databases. And you can take this lens and look at almost everything and discover that, yes, smaller is better. Of course, the entirety of what you build can't necessarily always be tiny because you're trying to do something of consequence. So then you think, well, why are smaller things better and easier to maintain? And that leads you to understanding encapsulation and decoupling and all these sorts of concepts in the context of a larger system. So whether it's management and like team organization or system design, I always take that view. Things need to be small and decoupled because that allows them to change. And things need to be able to change, whether it's software that needs to be changeable or organizations or mindsets or whatever. Maybe that's one reason I hate things like Scrum and OKRs, because it creates a large framework that ends up being monolithic because it has a name. But you need to have components that can be destroyed and replaced, just like those systems I was talking about at Wunderlist, where, okay, we can't get the Go service to scale, so we're going to rewrite it in Clojure tonight so we can go to bed, because it's small enough to do that, and it's decoupled, and the interface is clear enough that you can do that. Did that make sense for one?
Absolutely. That makes sense. Yeah. Another one?
Oh,
you don't
the
have
next
to have
one
another one.
is...
I think the first one was great already.
No, there's another one. You have to find a way to do things that are fun. Your job has to be fun, and if you're a manager, your team's job has to be fun. And it doesn't mean that everyone has to be excited about what the business does. Sometimes you're going to be on some IT team doing something boring, where you don't care about the outcome. Maybe you're not into, I don't know, manufacturing systems, but there's something cool about building the thing that helps to automate it. So for me, like as a human, and maybe this is part of what you saw trying to decode what the hell I was doing with my CV, is if I can't see how the thing I'm doing is fun, then I have to find something new. And fun can mean a lot of different things for me. Also applies to what I was talking about in the beginning with like you were learning piano and how you didn't want to learn theory. Part of the reason I think maybe we'd have more better software developers if you start with programming by coincidence and goofing around and playing is that you will find the fun and the energy and the excitement in the thing. And then you can do all the boring stuff around it, paying your dues, learning the theory that maybe is, parts of it aren't the most exciting to you because you understand the desire.
I think it's very important, though, that you have that moment when you jump from programming by coincidence to really knowing what you're doing, right? I mean, sometimes you also find, I sometimes see developers that never adopt the theory, but always, like, let's say, experiment with Node.js and TypeScript and JavaScript a bit without understanding really type safety and so on. It ends up really badly, right?
When Rails came on the scene, us old Rubyists used to laugh about how Rails people would come say, do I need to learn Ruby to do this? Because Rails presented something where you could be really productive and crank out new sites, in a way that wasn't really possible before. And so it attracted people who just wanted to play and do things by coincidence. And they didn't understand, I don't know, metaprogramming or the typing system in Ruby. It always seemed funny. But that's why I talk about how, in this context, and I know we're sort of going off topic, if fun and this approach were introduced in a formal education system, then you could build the entire curriculum around that with, the understanding that theory needs to be introduced at the right points. And by the end, you need a holistic view. But you're starting from a perspective that motivates the learner in a way that starting with theory does not. In the same way that if I say, hey, you want to learn electric guitar so you can play some rock music? Let's talk about the physics of vibration and how that makes different notes for a month. You're like, damn it, I just wanted to make some rock music. So I think people forget this, and especially in their careers, they forget it. But managers really forget it too. That if there isn't some way to create some excitement and fun around the thing that people are doing, they're not going to do it as well. It's not that they're less capable of doing it. It's that, ultimately they will be, because I know when I'm not enjoying myself, if it goes on and on and on, eventually I'm just terrible at the thing I'm doing. I'm not a good programmer or manager or whatever if I don't have fun every day. If I do, I'm thinking about it all the time and I'm excited and creative. So, I think that's critical, even though it kind of sounds like a superficial desire.
Yeah, but those moments, like in the morning for me under the shower, it's very important to have those aha moments, and that only comes if you have fun at work, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
otherwise you're going to be thinking about something else. You'll be in the shower dreading going to work instead of excited about what problem you're going to solve that day.
So you're a very technical person. Is there any like I'm the kind of guy who always discovers tools and annoys everyone with those. Is there anything you recently discovered, like a tool, a programming language, something technical that you right now annoy all your friends with?
Oh, sort of, although it's different. It's for the last few years in my side work and now with Blue Yard more dedicated, I have spent a lot of time with the decentralized web technologies, all the like post blockchain stuff. And um, this is an interesting one because people who maybe even who I've known for years will like talk about me like I've joined a cult if I even just reference any of these technologies. So it's just such a divisive thing right now. But there's so much cool stuff going on there and cool stuff to learn that if you can divorce yourself from the distaste for the tech bro day trader kind of culture that superficially exists in that world, there are just amazing things happening, whether it be, different approaches to decentralized systems or distributed systems and consensus, to different sort of fundamental understandings of how data should be shared and stored, even how identity is propagated. Like, a lot of the apps that I use now on the websites I authenticate with MetaMask. And so I'm in my browser and basically they are mainstreaming public key encryption. So, these are really good, cool things. And there's so much to learn there and it's so foreign. It sort of takes steps into cryptography, which most of us don't have a need or often desire to dig too deeply into in our normal software developer careers. And I think a lot of what's happening now, if you look at the landscape, you look at like NFTs and these ridiculously expensive JPEGs, you can look at it and just blow it off and say this is garbage. But there are fundamentals that are being built that are thrilling and absolutely like mind bending. And that's what I get excited about now. But I don't annoy my friends with it so much because they're so uninterested that I can't even start.
So you enter. It's hard to really understand what is happening in that world if you never touch it as a technical person, right? So you enter
Yes.
Solidity and so on these days, or you would recommend looking at Solidity or Ethereum?
Well, Ethereum, yes. Solidity is not an interesting programming language at all. It is just the way that you
JavaScript,
do
yeah.
smart contracts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
But
like,
the concept
yucky
behind,
JavaScript.
yeah.
Yes.
But the concept behind smart contracts essentially is what you learn if you touch it, and if you
Yes.
install web or the MetaMask extension on your browser and so on. That's really is a mind shift, right? You can then
Yeah.
there's like an aha moment when you understand, okay, yeah, I could build a company on it on behalf of it. I could pay people with in shares, and we could have a contract there which pays them automatically and so on. It's really crazy. Huh?
Yeah, and that's exciting, and that's like the mainstream stuff, like even DAOs, decentralized autonomous
Mm,
organizations, like
mm,
that as a
mm.
replacement for anything from user groups to companies to governments. Like you can really think big and bend your brain with this stuff. But from a tech perspective, because that's what you asked about, like Ethereum is a mainstream smart contract enabled blockchain that currently uses proof of work technologies for consensus, so similar to Bitcoin. There's proof of stake, which is a different sort of consensus mechanism that more chains are moving to, including Ethereum. But if you start looking at domain-specific blockchains and reading how those work. And one that we invested in with Blue Yard is called Filecoin. This is many years ago. That one changed my understanding, or at least my belief about what might be possible with this whole realm of technology. And the reason is Filecoin. So the short version is Filecoin is a distributed file sharing and serving technology. That's probably not quite accurate, but close enough. So it's a way of decentralizing file sharing, and the consensus mechanisms, in the same way that proof of work with Bitcoin and Ethereum, they drive this competition where miners are doing this incredibly inefficient thing. They're burning energy, but they're trying to mine these, generate these hashes. And the one that gets it first ends up being able to mine the block and then, create the block, and then therefore they get paid. Filecoin is the first project that I knew about that replaced that sort of consensus mechanism with something of value to the protocol itself. So they have proof of space-time, and generally the idea is all of the incentives that people are competing to win on so that they can be rewarded in this coin are things that make file serving better. Either it makes it more redundant or faster or geo-local or more censorship resistant, et cetera. And the idea of being able to design this consensus mechanism and protocol in other domain-specific ways is exciting, very exciting, because I can imagine an internet that works better, and even these things bleeding over into non-internet, like real life stuff. I don't know. It just really opened my eyes and opened my mind when I learned about it.
It's still hard to see the real applications in front of you straight away, right? But yeah, it's really, I'm like 100% sure that this is the future. It's still again and again, like in a way, a bit of a brain fuck whenever you look at it from an outside perspective and then try to understand the concept.
It's like Rust. It's like Rust and Haskell. There's too much to learn, so you might just think, well, that's too hard, But once you learn the concepts, it's not that hard. And we are in such early days. Unfortunately, it could be like Linux on the desktop. It has been the year of Linux on the desktop since 1996. This is the year it hits, but the UX just sucks, and it attracts nerdy developers to make nerdy interfaces, so it never broke out. Maybe that's where we're going to be with this Web3 stuff. I don't think so, but that's certainly where we are right now.
It could also be like mobile, right? So I remember my friends who jumped into mobile, and it was never taking off. And then you were always promising your friends, a mobile will come at a certain time, just be patient, and boom. Suddenly it all exploded, right? And Linux on the desktop, Android is quite popular, so
yeah, I know. It's just not a desktop.
You're right. Coming to my closing question, which is not so hard, no worries. If we had a time machine now and we could travel back to 2013 when you started as a CTO at Six Wunderkinder, what would you whisper into your young self's ears?
I guess I would just say it's going to be okay, because it is. But some days it didn't feel like it. It was. It's been a long road, and I've been very lucky. And I started out as a mostly white guy, so I have all the advantages of that. But I tend to throw myself into situations that emotionally hurt and are very stressful. And that's what I would tell myself. It'll be okay and it's worth it. I think what we did, we made some good choices, and we made some great software. And honestly, at Wunderlist, I built and it wasn't me, but we built the system of my dreams. And I have almost no regrets about what we implemented technically. I don't know if I've ever created something where at the end I say, this is great. I want to keep doing this. I want to keep doing stuff like this, I probably would tell myself that, that instinct you have that after an acquisition, you should leave. That instinct is correct and you should go with it sooner. And that goes with knowing oneself and feeling confident enough to turn things down when they're offered. I mentioned my ego when I'm offered management jobs. I get excited. I ultimately left Microsoft not because the company was bad to me. Quite the contrary. It was, for most people, I think, a wonderful place to work. But for me, I knew very early this was not a fit, and I'm now finished with the segment of my career where I allow that nagging feeling to continue. I think that's what I would tell myself if there was anything to change, that when it doesn't feel quite right, it's not. So don't stick with it. Work isn't supposed to feel that way. That's probably not useful for the listeners. I apologize, but that's my answer.
Thanks a lot, Chad. It was really nice chatting to you, and blessed to have this conversation. I hope we can have it again at a certain time.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll meet in person. It will be great.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Enjoy your day.
You too.